questions to our panel on the budget, but as I said before, you should feel free to phone in about anything you like. On the panel today, to my left, Dame Andrea Leadsom, Conservative MP for South Northamptonshire and former Cabinet Minister. Next to her is Stephen Bush, columnist for and Associate Editor of the Financial Times, spent many years working for the New Statesman. To my right, Juliet Samuel, columnist for the Times. She wrote her first column for the Times today, very exciting, I'm sure, on the budget. And she's a Senior Fellow of Policy Exchange. And next to her, Richard Burgon, Labour MP for Leeds East, and he's also the Secretary of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs. If you'd like to give us a call, the number to call 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, as ever, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, it's always good to start off with a controversial question, and that's what we're going to do with Colin in Kilmarnock. Colin, fire away.
Hi, Iain, you all right?
Fine.
My question is that people have chosen to have children, and children have to be paid for. I would like an Aston Martin car. I wouldn't go to Aston Martin dealership and put a deposit down, take the car, then 4 months later say, oh, I can't afford it. Government, will you pay for it? I don't understand why me, as a 52-year-old man with no kids, I'm expected to contribute some of my taxes to pay for people's children. And that's about it,
Andrea,
really, Iain.
OK, well, let's... Andrea Leadsom.
Well, that's a really punchy start there, Colin. I mean, obviously, the point about childcare is it does then enable women and men to get back into the workplace, so it is good for the overall economy. But the broader point is that, you know, if you go down that route, that you should only pay for what you get out, then why do you pay for education for anyone? Why do you pay for roads unless you're a driver? You know, why do you pay for healthcare unless you're sick? Yeah, clearly, yeah. So I think as a broader point, you know, there are things that are good for our economy, good for our society, and as British citizens, that's what we all contribute to, and we make sure it's a very progressive tax rate so that those who earn the most pay the highest share.
Apart from on pensions.
Well, you know, if you look at the British Medical Association, not known for their support of a Conservative government, they are saying this is what they have been campaigning for years, to try and ensure that we don't lose senior doctors, surgeons, consultants from the NHS who are being effectively disincentivised from having huge tax charges on excess pensions and being pushed into
We may have a
retirement.
question on that later, so I shouldn't have diverted you down that particular rabbit hole. Stephen Bush.
Well, look, I also don't have children, but I hope to one day be old enough that I may need some adult social care. So it's in my interest for other people to have children, even if I don't myself have them. And actually, one of the problems is people aren't having children because they can't afford them. That's why the UK population is not at replacement rate in terms of the number of people having children. It's why so many people, mostly women, have to give up their jobs to be full-time carers for their children, which is why we have so many vacancies, which is why one of the reasons why we have a sluggish economy. So this isn't a kind of... This policy about childcare benefits me, benefits Colin, benefits everyone in this studio, whether they have children, whether those children are 1 to 18 or none at all. We all benefit from other people having kids.
Mm.
But Colin's basic point is that I imagine that parents should be looking after their children, not necessarily the mother, but parents should be looking after them rather than the taxpayer.
Well, they are, but that's why we have so many job vacancies, right? This is the thing, is that this is not this fundamentally, this childcare policy is partly, yes, because Jeremy Hunt is spooked by the Labour Party who've been talking a lot about this, but the big reason to do it is to get more people, mostly women, back into the workforce because we've got a big economic activity problem. And this is why, you know, I don't want to get too far onto the pension stuff now, but this is why these two policies do need to be considered together, because they are fundamentally about fixing that labour market problem that we have.
And just to be clear, when you have childcare, that doesn't mean you've outsourced your children. You know, everyone's saying, well, why should women look after their children, or women should look after them? They do, and so do dads. You know, parents do there's 24 hours in a day. Childcare is maybe 6 or 8 hours if you're lucky.
I suppose we all look at this through the prism of our own situation and our own background. And I mean, I was very lucky that I grew up on a farm and both my parents were farmers, and sort of my mother was there all the time. So, I mean, my father was, I suppose, as well. And I think how different would my life have been had I been farmed out to a childcarer at the age of 9 months? I mean, I didn't even go to nursery school. I went to primary school at 5 years old, and I wasn't socialised really, apart from sort of friends and relatives before that. And I think from that point of view, it's maybe a very good thing that children do sort of exist outside their own family unit and learn how to sort of make friends, which, I mean, I didn't. I've always been a shy and retiring type, as you know, Andrea.
Yeah.
Richard Burgon.
I can't believe it, Iain. Colin's question has meant that I agree with Andrea on the first point, which I never thought.
This is what I like to bring people together.
So Colin's brought us together. I mean, this policy doesn't just affect people who have children. I think it affects us all. When we look, for example, at the huge number of vacancies in the NHS, we look at nursing, for example, which at the moment is a female-dominated part of the workforce, and there are so many women, all the data shows, who want to be at work, who can't be because of the cost of childcare, or who are at work and want to work more hours but are prevented from doing so because of the cost of childcare. So when we're looking at getting more people working in our public services, filling the vacancies, when we're looking, as you say, Iain, at socialising children so they come into contact with other children, and all the information shows that the most impactful years in a person's future, the first 4 years of their life, all of these things come to bear. So I think that Colin will benefit from women being able to go to work who feel held back by the childcare arrangements, and from more men and women getting into the workplace. But the final point I'd make on this policy of childcare, it is welcome, and people have been calling on this for a long time. But there are some concerns starting to be raised by experts about whether sufficient funding will be in place so that there will be the provision required. So you can have free childcare in theory, but if there aren't enough places funded for that, then it is just a theoretical freedom. So the government really needs to get to grips with that aspect.
I was saying earlier, I listened to Stella Creasy talking to my colleague Sheila Fogarty earlier, and she was saying that she was worried about that and said, well, look, had the government not given £6 billion to motorists in terms of keeping the fuel duty level frozen, that if that had gone into childcare as well, that would have solved the problem, not overnight, but it would have meant that everyone could be sure that the places would be available. Juliet Samuel.
Well, I think on that he did increase the payment that nurseries or childminders are going to get by about 30%, which he said, to be fair, I haven't checked this with them, which he said was what the industry was asking for. So that, in theory, should cover that point. Personally, I would prefer to see a childcare approach that essentially allowed parents to choose whether they were going to be paid to look after their children or whether they were going to be paid to put them in childcare with other people. Now, that wouldn't obviously have quite the labour market effect that the government wants. So I understand why they did it this way, given the particular problems that we're facing. But I do think it would be healthier for some of the issues that you were talking about raising children, about parents' choice as to who they want to look after their children, whether it's they themselves or grandparents or other relatives. I think it would be probably healthier for families and for children if they had the choice and if the funding was flexible to enable them to do that.
So the taxpayer should pay parents to look after their own children during the day?
Well,
seriously?
Currently we have a situation where if two households decide they're going to swap their children, they can then claim funding for that because that's someone else looking after their child. But if they're going to look after their own children, then they can't. That's a slightly perverse situation to put families into. So I don't think what you're looking at me as if I'm crazy, but actually, no. The current policy is a bit crazy.
I don't think you're crazy. Let me put that firmly on the record, Andrea.
Can I just come in there? I think that's a really interesting point, Juliet, and what I would be seeking for the government government to do is to look at the tax system, because actually the reason why childcare costs here are so high is because of your after-tax income being so much lower. And that is in part because couples are taxed separately. And as we know with the child benefit and so on, it effectively penalises you for staying at home. And actually there's all sorts of things you could do within the tax system to provide flexible childcare. And to your point about grandparents provide an awful lot of care. And for many, it means they have to give up work, they have to reduce their hours, and it's not cost-free. And it does seem to me, since we have an attendance allowance if you were looking after your elderly husband, sorry John, but he'll hate me forever for that.
He won't be listening.
Okay, good. But you could get an attendance allowance for looking after him of about 70 quid a week. But if you are a grandparent looking after your grandchildren, you get nothing. So if you want to do it, it's really out of the goodness of your heart. So I wouldn't agree that you should pay people the full rate of childcare to do that, but I think some consideration would go a long way to providing parental family choice.
Now, I've never had to look after 4 2-year-olds, let alone 5 2-year-olds. Are any of you concerned about this sort of the ratio being increased, that one person would now be able to look after 5 rather than 4?
No, because in other countries this is normal, and somehow they manage to avoid disasters, whether children have eaten the curtains or something. So I do think that, and I actually think this is one of the only policies that has actually addressed the cost of childcare provision. So we're talking about the cost as if all that matters is, what parents have to lay out. But actually, the cost of the whole economy also matters. And if you're imposing a lot of very strenuous requirements that don't necessarily relate to the welfare or the safety of the child, then that's an unnecessary cost you're putting on either the taxpayer or on parents. So I think that that's a positive step in actually reducing costs for the whole industry.
One thing I don't understand is, given that there is a huge demand now for professional childcare, and yet the number of nurseries that are closing exceeds the numbers that are opening, you'd think, well, isn't there a huge gap in the market here for new entrants to come into the... Do you think that these announcements today are actually going to encourage people to come into the childcare market?
Well, look, part of the problem is, although government talks about free childcare hours, they're not free. What happens is the government gives the provider a certain amount of money, and that money doesn't actually meet the cost of caring for it. So one of the reasons why the rest of your childcare is so expensive at the moment is then the provider uses the cost they're losing on the free hours by going, okay, well, your 2-year-old, that's going to cost more. You have a lunch cost, that's going to cost more. And so it's not clear whether or not the beneficial change to ratios, which I agree with Juliet, it's the same as in Scotland and Wales, where to my knowledge children are not running feral. Does that mean that the costs then work? Possibly. But Richard's exactly right to say that there's a real risk here that we have free childcare in theory but not in practice.
Richard, do you want to round this off?
Yeah, well, I think it's a policy that will be welcomed by lots of people across the country. They've been pushing for it. But like with many things in a budget, it remains to be seen how it's going to be put into practice in reality. So I think we need to be pushing for proper funding for childcare, for the people who work in childcare to be properly valued for the important role they do, being paid properly. And if that can be done, then it can be a real life-changing policy, in my opinion, if it's carried out correctly, for families and young people, and can help to boost the economy.
Can I just put in a word for childminders? Because that, there was an encouragement, a bit of support for childminders, but of course for family choice again. To your point about, is 5 2-year-olds a problem? I actually think it can be a problem, yes. But actually, a home setting, particularly when you've got a 9-month-old or even a 6-month-old, much better to be in a home setting. And childminders are often parents themselves. And actually, we could do a lot more to create much more capacity in the system, as well as choice for parents through a huge raft of support for childminders.
OK, well, we'll come to more of your calls in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. It's Cross Question. It's 16 minutes past 8.
LBC.
We have with us on Cross Question Andrea Leadsom, Richard Burgon, Juliet Samuel and Stephen Bush. Let's go to our next caller. It's Pete in Bristol. Pete, hello. What would you like to ask?
Evening. I just want to ask, why should a 30-year-old professional with no children stay in this country and not just go find a job somewhere else?
Is that what you're thinking of doing?
Absolutely, yes.
Richard?
Well, the other day, I took my dad to see to the hospital in Leeds, and the doctor was telling us there, after he'd given my dad some very good news, about some of his fears about the future in the NHS, and he raised this very point. He was nearing the end of his professional life, but he said that there are young healthcare professionals who are opting to go to Canada, who are opting to go to the United States even, and other countries, because they see a better future for themselves there in terms of pay, in terms of terms and conditions, and in terms of opportunities. I think this is something we really need to look at, because I think we've ended up in a situation where this year and next year is going to be the biggest reduction in living standards since records began in the 1950s. And I think maybe for the first time ever, people can't say with confidence that their children are going to do better than they did in terms of living standards and have more opportunities than they did. So inevitably, there'll be plenty of people who are young professionals or who want to be in professions or who want a different life, who may think of moving abroad. And we can't afford that for the future of our country, particularly since post-Brexit. We've had really an exodus of workers back to mainland Europe as well. So I think this is something we really need to get a grip
Not
of.
wholly true, and that's still been a net influx of people from the EU come into the country. But, I mean, people did leave. You are partly, maybe for that, partly because of the pandemic. Juliet?
Well, I mean, there could be lots of good places that you could go and live. I mean, maybe they shouldn't is the answer, but I happen to think this is a pretty good place to live. We have pretty entrenched freedoms. We have an economy that's, yes, it's going through a pretty tough time at the moment, and there have been some pretty appalling long-term decisions made by governments. But I do think that it's an inherently dynamic economy with a lot of creativity and sort of genius buried within it. I think there's a lot of fascinating things that you can still do in this country, and so I would still bet on it. But yeah, I can understand why someone who's maybe trapped in a bad marginal tax bracket, looking at the cost of energy and looking at the state of the health service, may think that this isn't the best place to be. One thing I would say, though, is that a lot of equivalent countries, developed countries, are facing the same set of issues to do with costs of energy, demographics, shrinking workforces. So it may be quite tough to find somewhere that is immune from these problems. I would probably bet on the UK, but not everyone would.
And of course, nowadays it's easier to move around the world, isn't it? I mean, I remember the last time that there really was a brain drain from this country when I was a teenager in the 1970s. It was a real thing, but I mean that was a much bigger thing to go and live in another country then than it is now.
Exactly, and that I think is the point. I mean, my answer to Pete is, do it. Why wouldn't you? You're 30, you've got no kids, you're an engineer. Those are transferable skills. Have fun. The world is a much smaller place. I think the whole idea of being able to travel around the world, work in different places, experience new things, it's fantastic. Aren't we lucky living in the 21st century that those options are open to us?
And do it when you're 30 rather than 40.
Exactly right. But actually, by the way, when you look at sort of where do you want to end up, the UK is a fantastic place. And I don't, obviously the UK economy has gone through a problematic period, but as a member of the Treasury Committee, we had the EU's Econ Committee, which is the equivalent scrutiny committee for the EU, coming over to chat to us informally and saying things are terrible in the European Union. They are also having massive problems, just the same as we are. So actually, I think there is a tendency to think the grass is greener on the other side, but it definitely is a fantastic thing to do, to travel and work. I remember going to Australia Australia for a year when I was about 27 and absolutely loved it and nearly emigrated, actually. I bet you're wishing I had, Richard. But anyway,
no, not at all.
I said it for you.
I'm delighted. That's not what I was thinking, Andrea. I'm delighted you've stayed and that you're on LBC with us tonight. But the only point I would make is Andrew's right. It's wonderful if people have the opportunity to go and live in another country for a while and work there and enjoy the culture there and explore another country. But I think maybe at the heart of Pete's question, I don't know, is the idea of people not having the pull of abroad, but maybe the push from here. And so if people want to leave for a positive reason or experiencing something elsewhere, then that's great. But if people feel there aren't enough opportunities here and the cost of housing is too high, the cost of energy bills are too high, and the earning potential here isn't as good as we move towards a bit of a trend towards a low-wage economy, then that would very much concern.
Just before I come to Steve and Pete, just to explain a little bit more about why you're thinking about this.
I mean, I actually have a house as well. I'm on the property market and things like that, and I'm actually pretty shielded from the energy prices just because I've got a fixed rate and all that. But basically, I see things like ARM Technologies. This is like our biggest chip manufacturer. It's going to get listed in the US. Yeah, we're focusing on such small, pathetic things in this country. I mean, every time people talk about small boats, I'm looking at my passport and wondering where I can go. And the complications that we're going to have between us and the EU now, why would I not just go to the EU? I don't want to put up with this stuff. And the people that are coming up with this rhetoric, they ain't helping me. They might be assisting people who are scared of things, scared of change and stuff like that. But they're not helping the people that are growing in this country. And we're just wondering, why would we stay?
OK, Stephen, why should you stay?
Well, look, that's actually, I think it's a question that policymakers should be thinking about more. I think one of the really disappointing things in this budget was we had these investment zones, and the Cambridge Arc was not one of them, right? This area with a huge amount of developable land around it, lots of growing businesses in the industries of the future, and essentially what we've decided, because too many of them might vote Lib Dem, then they don't get to be in an investment zone under a Conservative government.
Well, most of the investment zones are in Labour areas.
Well, they're in marginal areas in the Red Wall. So look, I think
no, they're not.
I think ultimately we are in a war for talent. Just as businesses are, states are in a war for talent too. And actually, the UK offer to a 30-something without dependent children, with a STEM degree, is not that great. Particularly in a world where most of the world speaks English. I mean, look. If you imagine the life of an engineer in New York and compare it to their life in London, are we equipping our metro mayors, our banks, our businesses, our scientific industries to compete with the future of the moment? I mean, visibly we're not.
The UK is competing on a global scale. We are in the top 3 of foreign direct investment. We're a technology superpower. We're massively investing in science and technology and research and development and space technology. I mean, if you listen to what the Chancellor was saying today, the UK has everything going for us, and particularly for engineers. We are desperate. The opportunities for people with STEM degrees are absolutely vast. I just completely don't see at all what you're saying.
Are you saying that you think New York is a far more attractive city for people to go to and work in and live in than London? Because I would raise my eyebrows at that.
Well, I mean, if you look at the per head amount people can earn, visibly, just in terms of what people in equivalent industries earn, it is a more attractive value proposition, right? Whether you are an academic or even a relatively lowly paid job like a journalist, right? Ultimately, New York is.
I'm getting the onion out of my pocket as we speak.
New York is at the moment a more attractive district. Now, Juliet's exactly right to point to our enduring freedoms, much more stable democracy. I mean, I'm much less concerned than the end of the democratic experiment's going to happen in London than I would be if I lived in New York. But policymakers really should be asking, what are they doing for 30 and 40-something-olds? I mean, we don't enforce minor crimes. There are potholes everywhere you look. We've all had these various
money for potholes.
A lot of money for potholes.
Pay disputes.
A lot of money for the police.
So, the central question does have to be, what is the state doing for those?
See, I think that is a really interesting thing, because there's no vision at the moment. I mean, okay, maybe we've had enough of visionaries in politics. I don't know, but this was such a sort of humdrum budget. There was no long-term vision, and I know politicians are always accused of being short-termist because of electoral cycles, but I think people want to. I mean, back in the 70s, when we were in a similar economic situation in a way, at least Margaret Thatcher was somebody who had whether you agreed with it or not, she had a vision for the country, and people either related to it or they didn't. But I don't know what Rishi Sunak's vision is. I don't really know what Keir Starmer's vision is either.
Well,
Not sure you do, Richard.
Well, I think that Jeremy Hunt's speech today was devoid of vision and devoid of detail, and it was a budget where people around the country will have been tuning in to listen to it, hoping that there would be some vision, especially when people's wages have been hit so hard. We've got a situation now whereby people reflect upon the fact that if wages had continued to increase at the level they were before the banking crisis, then the average wage in this country would be £10,000 higher per year now. So we've seen this long period of the value of people's wages falling, and there wasn't much. You know, we talked about the welcome advance in relation to childcare earlier, but for me that was the biggest policy today, an important policy, but there needed to be more policies about living standards, about the NHS given the huge crisis.
Nothing on housing, which is a question that will come up in a moment. Thank you all very much. Stay with us. They're all here till 9 o'clock, so lots of time to get your questions in. 0345 6060 973. Pete, thank you very much. A really thought-provoking question there from you. It is 8:30 on LBC. Tim Daly has the news headlines.
Jeremy Hunt's delivered his first budget with a focus on getting people out to work. The Chancellor went further on childcare than expected. Working parents with youngsters 9 months to 5 years old will get up to 30 hours of free childcare in England every week from September 2025. The lifetime allowance, the total amount people can accumulate in their pensions before paying extra tax, is being abolished with the aim of keeping people in employment for longer, and the current support with energy bills continues until June. Labour has described today's package of measures as lacking ambition. And hundreds of thousands of workers have been on strike today. It's thought to have been the biggest single day of walkouts since the current wave of industrial action began. LBC weather, rain pushing eastwards tonight, and it will be heavy at times in the west. A breezy night, but staying milder for many, with a low of -1 degree.
The Budget 2023 on LBC.
It's 8:33. On Cross Question, we have Dame Andrea Leadsom, Richard Burgon, Juliet Samuel and Stephen Bush. Let's go to our next question. It's a text question from Ian. No, not me. As the value of Credit Suisse shares plummets, plus the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, are we nearing a repeat of 2008? Stephen Bush from the FT, I have to come to you first on this, obviously.
I worried you might. I mean, so so one of the important differences in the UK is we know that UK banks are, for the most part, well capitalised. The vulnerability is that in the US, small banks manage to successfully argue that if they were below a certain size, they ought not to have to be regulated in the same way as the globally systemic banks. But obviously, that's insane, because that means, and basically, if a bank gets to be 49 billion, then suddenly they're 50 billion and they're systemically important, and it turns out they've got lots of, they're badly capitalised. Well, what do you do at that point? Swear and blow up your bank, your banking system. So we should be worried about this. We should be worried about Credit Suisse. However, also some of the things that were done, including on the recommendation of some of my eminent colleagues like Martin Wolf, have put the UK banking system in a better place. But we should be very aware that this is a very risky time, and one of the problems in this budget is he has blown through quite a lot of his headroom. It's actually the tightest headroom to meet a fiscal rule than any finance minister in the UK has had. So it is a worrying time.
But this is Switzerland. I mean, we always think of Switzerland and Swiss banks as about as safe as you can get. I mean, that's why I think people are worried.
Well, this is the thing, is that we often talk about risky behaviour, but actually it's not risky behaviour that causes financial crises. It's behaviour that turns out to be risky that you thought was safe. Because when when I make a bet and I know it's not going to come off, I'm not planning to, pay my mortgage with it. Whereas when I make something which I think is safe and then I don't have the money I need, that's when financial crises start. So it's exactly why it's worrying, because, the banking sector in Switzerland's had a number of difficult stories. Credit Suisse's reputation's had a battering for a variety of reasons. But it does, it's an alarming picture.
Andrea, you were Business Secretary, you were also Treasury Minister, and you were a banker, so you are eminently qualified to comment on this.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think CSFB have their own problems, as Stephen says. Their accounts have been qualified, I believe, and they have had some very big issues with trading losses. But number one is the problem that actually anybody who was a bit younger than me probably thinks that interest rates norm is about 2 or 3 or 4%. And actually, for me, I remember with my first flat when we crashed out of the ERM and suddenly my mortgage went from about 4% to 15%.
Me too.
That was terrifying. But actually, that's what's happened, is the trading losses. People who'd bought basically low-risk assets, government gilts, US government treasuries, etc., who then found that they were worth much less than they thought they were, and particularly when they were leveraged. And that is a fundamental problem, and that's where the systemic risk comes in. Because if you find yourself in a situation where everyone's looking for who's next, at the moment, Silicon Valley Bank was an isolated case. Now you've got CSFB, which could be another isolated case because of a different reason, which is its own poor performance. But on the other hand, you then do get people thinking, right, what happens now? And that's where the systemic issue kicks in. And that's what happened in 2008-09, was that people stopped trusting each other. And it's like the oil was sucked out of the engine of the financial services sector, and then it suddenly all collapses. So, I mean, for me, when we were first in government in 2010, we introduced ring fencing. And as City Minister, I was quite materially involved with that, which was separating out the sort of retail bit of a bank from the wholesale bit of a bank. And actually, I think that helped with sorting out Silicon Valley Bank. With all of the UK banking sector, they are ring-fenced. And so actually there is a lot of protection, unlike 2008-09, but nevertheless the stakes are high and people are now quite understandably worried.
It's quite a sobering thought for people of our kind of age. I think we're vaguely similar. That if there
you're
were
a lot older than me.
I'm a little older than you, I think.
No, a lot.
No. If there was another sort of Lehman-style collapse, and I mean, I don't think we are talking about that, but there could be. I mean, we could live the rest of our lives in a time where the good times are never going to come back.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, Richard made the point, since 2008-09, people's potential for their living standards to rise has been eaten away. It is still a hangover from that last financial crisis. And then you sort of add to that the, Putin's invasion and the pandemic, etc. When's it going to end? And just exactly as you say, if we had another banking crisis now, it would be disastrous. Again, I do not believe that we're in that situation. It's not like 2008-09. Banks are much better capitalised. The regulators are much, much more aware. But the thing that does concern me is sentiment. You've seen the stock markets losing a lot of share, etc.
Richard, if you can answer while I just Google Andrea's age.
Don't you dare.
I was speaking to somebody in Parliament today, one of the members of staff, and we were talking about this, and they're relatively young. And basically, because Iain just said, imagine if for the rest of your life things don't get any better. But for young people as well, some of them have only ever known through their adult life difficult economic times. Now, of course, people will be scared when they hear this news about the banks. They'll hope it doesn't become systemic. And people are worried after so much bad economic news over the years. And that's why when Jeremy Hunt said today that technically we're not in a recession, and I know we're not because it's not 2 quarters, meaning that we're technically in a recession, that people out there think things aren't normal economically, things aren't good economically, and the government and Jeremy Hunt shouldn't pretend that they are. But when it comes to the subject of banking, obviously the government needs to think, what do we do about banking in this country? It concerns me that the government's removed the caps on bankers' bonuses. It concerns me that the government has started to remove some of the protections and regulations put in place since the banking crisis in 2008. Because that makes me worry that we're going to get an increase in likelihood of risky behaviour, which could make systemic problems more likely. And I think that will worry people out there.
Juliet, you've been writing about financial affairs for long. Your Twitter handle is City Samuel, so we know what your specialisation is. How worried are you?
Well, I'm not worried in the sense that this is a crisis caused by central banks, and it's one that can probably be alleviated by them. As Andrea said, this is about interest rates. It's not about bankers' bonuses. The fact is central banks messed up. They massively overstimulated economies during COVID. You could understand the first round of that because no one quite knew how it was all going to play out. But they kept doing it even after there was warning after warning that you're stoking inflation, there's too much demand. All of the supply chain mess resulted from that. And now what we have is inflation. That's resulted in interest rates having to be put up. And they're having to be put up much faster than anyone anticipated. That is what is leading to all of these banks and things like crypto being caught out, because everyone got used to a situation where tech stocks were booming, money was cheap. They embarked on this huge experiment, quantitative easing, into the teeth of a huge fiscal stimulus. So demand went through the roof, and it was boom times. And then and now we're having to adjust far too quickly. Whereas if you were able to adjust slower, you could probably see some of this work through the system in a stable way. So what's now going to happen is that interest rates will have to rise much less quickly. We may have to tolerate more inflation than we would otherwise as a result, because otherwise, some new part of the financial system that's been overstimulated is going to blow up. So we had the LDI pension funds in the autumn. We've had Silicon Valley Bank. Who knows where it's next going to hit? But this is something that we should lay at the feet of central banks.
Okay. Right, let's move on to another question. By the way, the difference in age is 10 months, Andrea.
Ian, you're not my friend.
Let's move on to a text question from Michael in Warrington. Actually, no, let's do that one a little bit later. I want to do this one first. Jenny in Solihull says, do you trust TikTok? Richard, are you on TikTok?
I'm on TikTok, but I don't have it on my phone. And I know that there have been warnings, haven't there, about TikTok, warnings to senior civil servants around the world and senior politicians as well. And so I don't have it on my phone. I do use it. I think TikTok's a great way.
Any funny dances?
I don't do any funny dances. If I tried to dance,
go on,
it would
Richard.
be funny.
Go on. You know you want to.
I don't
do
want
it now.
to.
Come on, do it
I don't
now.
want to. Not to offend
Are you
the
worried
viewers.
about China's effectively spying? I mean, the fact that you don't have it on your phone indicates that you are.
Well, I think we need to ensure that it's secure. I think it's a great tool for politicians and normal people as well to communicate with each other. But I think we need to make sure it's secure, and obviously we need to heed the warnings to politicians around the world and civil servants about ensuring that their security and their data and their information isn't compromised in this way.
Well, fairly brief answers on this, Andrea.
I think TikTok's very worrying from the security point of view, but also from the user point of view. And a lot of my experience of social media is through my kids. And you see the kind of levels of abuse. So it's worrying in all sorts of ways. And I do think that the online harms bill can't come soon enough.
Are you on it?
No, I'm not on TikTok, no.
Stephen?
No, I'm not very with it. I'm not on TikTok.
But do you have a view on it?
Look, I think ultimately it's a bit of a problem when you have a very influential social media network that is not one that is easily regulatable by government. And I think Andrew's exactly right. Look, this is why the online bill does needs to be taken seriously, needs to go through. It's a big and complex bit of ambitious legislation, but it's really important that it's done and it's got right.
Juliet?
No, you shouldn't trust TikTok. Arguably it should be banned. You can't trust TikTok with your data. The Chinese government can access effectively any data it wants. In fact, the parent company of TikTok has a Communist Party official on its board. So the notion that it can be independent or independently regulated by UK regulators is complete nonsense. And moreover, the content of TikTok, if you look at it within China, TikTok's all about education and, news and helping children to learn new things or connect with new people. That's not what it's about in Western countries. In Western countries, it seems to be about a ratchet effect of, addiction to content, people, whether it's self-harm videos or, gender dysphoria, algorithms recommending more and more stuff. So, which I think is very revealing because even the Chinese government doesn't trust its own country's children to TikTok, and we shouldn't either.
Well, you've convinced me. I'm about to delete it on my phone because I am on it.
Good for you.
But I've never really worked out why I'm on it because I have someone do it for me because I don't understand it. Delete app. Do you want to delete it? Delete.
You've ruined the
There
mystery.
you go.
Ian.
It's
You've ruined
gone.
the mystery, the illusion that you would do it yourself. That's what
No,
people like.
I'm quite open that
Now
I
they
don't do it
know.
myself because I don't see the point of it. But anyway, we will come to another question in just a moment. It's 8:45.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Free childcare extended to infants aged 1 and 2 under a back-to-work budget today. As part of Jeremy Hunt's drive to tackle chronic labour shortages and encourage hundreds of thousands more Britons into work. Nicola's in Midhurst.
I'm a childcare provider. At the moment, childcare providers are closing every single day. The level of funding we get is absolutely shocking.
Chris in Watford.
We're absolutely elated with the news that we may be receiving these 33 hours. Is fantastic for us. It's going to make things a hell of a lot easier.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
Right, let's move on to Michael in Warrington. He's got a text question. He says, is the government right to essentially just ignore union leaders now and let them hold their strikes and then get back to work? Juliet.
I'm not sure if that's what the strategy is. Maybe it is. I do think that they're right to resist some of the crazier pay demands that have been coming out of unions. 36%, I think, was the junior doctors' demand. I do think they messed up in not preempting some of this and sticking resolutely to their line, which was the pay commission is going to set pay levels and we're not going to talk about it. Quite transparently, the reason that happened was because the Tories were too busy holding a leadership contest and they took their eye off the ball and then they dug in. So I do think they have themselves to blame for some of this. But I do think ultimately the right approach is to move some distance, but not to give in to some of the wilder demands. And if junior doctors are going to persist with a 36% pay demand, then they have to be ignored. They have to be resisted because that is just completely unrealistic.
Well, finally, a question that Richard and Andrea won't agree on. Do you want to kick off, Richard?
Wow. You never know. Andrea may have been convinced. She may have seen me speak at a picket line and she may think, actually, do you know what? I was wrong.
I think
all
I
along.
can confidently predict that won't be the case.
I think you're right, Ian. I think, and you won't be surprised to know this, that the government shouldn't ignore the demands of key public sector workers.
Even if they are outrageous, 36%.
Well, the government needs to negotiate properly with them. Early today, I was in Trafalgar Square, and there's a big rally of teachers from around the country, and people are struggling to make ends meet. And these are people who helped to get us through the pandemic. And of course, I understand that it's inconvenient for all of us. It's inconvenient for the public when strike action takes place. But people don't take strike action lightly. They lose pay, and you've got teachers who are committed to the children. NHS staff who are committed to the patients. They don't want to take strike action. They feel they've got no other option. And what I haven't liked is the way that the government has seek to demonise some of the workers by some of the language we've seen in the House of Commons chamber, and also this draconian anti-strike bill, which really undermines the hard-won democratic right to strike in this country. Because whether or not people agree with an individual strike, it's important that we have the right to strike in this country. It's a key democratic right. But it's no coincidence that all this strike action is taking place now. We've got profits soaring at the top, but people struggling to make ends meet. We've seen a proliferation of food banks being used in hospitals, for example. I know the Conservative MP, Lee Anderson, has sought to, the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party has sought to dismiss that. But look, trade union members, striking teachers, striking nurses, junior doctors, they're members of the public too. And I think one of the reasons that there's been more public support for this strike action than the government might have predicted is because everyone is in, or the majority of people are in the same boat. They've been feeling the economic situation in their pockets, and all workers really deserve a decent pay rise. And can I just say one last thing, Ian? The government could have made a choice today, and this is a policy I've been proposing, that if we were to equalise capital gains tax with income tax, so to equalise the kind of tax you'd pay selling a second, third or fourth home for those in that position with income tax, that alone would raise £17 billion, and it would only cost £12 billion to give every public sector worker in this country an inflation-matching pay rise. Those levels were... capital gains tax and income tax did match even during some of Margaret Thatcher's periods. That's a choice the government could have made.
I'm sensing the truce is well and truly over, Andrea.
Well, I'm trying to find something on which I can agree with Richard, and I have found something.
Have you?
Okay. So where I agree with Richard is that it's very important that the government keeps talking and keeps negotiating and stays open to discussion. And I think I would agree that hasn't always happened, and it should. However, as a Conservative, I believe in rights and responsibilities, and I fundamentally disagree that it should be fine for ambulances and doctors and nurses to provide no minimum service. And that's what the anti-strike bill was about, was ensuring that if you've had the training, the skill, the job, the trust put in you to save lives, to transport people to work and back and so on, then you shouldn't actually be able to fully withdraw your labour, just leaving people to fend for themselves. And so some sort of minimum service level, I think, is absolutely fundamental. And then I totally agree with Juliet that some of the demands have just been entirely unreasonable. And then it is very difficult where the demands are beyond all logic. It cannot be that government will have a sensible conversation about those things. It has to cut both ways. It's not only public service workers who supported people through the pandemic, the delivery drivers, the supermarket workers, lots of people in the private sector too, who gave everything, and they're not on strike demanding those kind of pay rises.
Stephen?
Well, look, in every dispute over wages, there are essentially three components. There's what you, the employer, wants to pay, there's what the employee wants to pay, and then there's crucially what the competition will pay. So we've actually got a pretty good signal that junior doctors aren't making that ridiculous a demand because of the market signal that they can and are leaving the country to go and work for other bits of other healthcare systems. But look, ultimately, one of the reasons why we haven't seen action on this is because the government, reasonably enough, didn't want the budget to be about them caving to these various demands. But if you look at a lot of these disputes, many of them are nearing a resolution. That's going to be one of the big subplots of the next fiscal event, because the Chancellor said, look, this has to come out of your departmental budget. That will be what happens with these pay settlements. But then, of course, he'll have to top them up a bit in the autumn.
Right, let's move on to another question. It's from David in Sheffield. Hello, David.
Hello, yeah, thank you for taking my call. Yeah, basically, I'm just asking if the MPs are going to support the bill to stop the importation of trophies in trophy hunting. I think it's going to be held in the next few days.
Right, well, Parliament is going to be voting on Friday on a government-backed measure to ban the importation of trophies hunted abroad. 5 southern African nations, though, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, South Africa and Namibia, say this move will actually hinder animal conservation work. Well, let's start off with the MPs. Andrea, I don't know if you're going to be there on Friday, but would you support this measure?
I would support this measure. Actually, as when I was in DEFRA, I went and supported the illegal wildlife conference in Vietnam and then brought it back to the UK, and which Michael Gove then did when he took over from me. I absolutely support this measure. On the other hand, the point you made about some southern African countries saying it will hinder development, it doesn't have to. So actually, the argument is if you allow wealthy people to hunt big game, then it effectively creates money for conservation. That can still happen without necessarily hunting big game. You could actually photograph big game, for example. So I think that there are other measures. And so, yes, I wouldn't support being able to import hunting trophies.
I mean, I wonder, those countries have said this. I think I read a quote in one of the papers the other day from someone in Southern Africa saying this is sort of sub-colonial, that you're trying to impose your values on us. And maybe we are, but I have to say, when I see pictures of these very rich, generally white men with their guns sitting proudly by a dead lion, my stomach turns. Richard?
I agree totally. Very disturbing pictures when you see people showing off about these beautiful wild animals that they've killed in order to take a horn or whatever it may be as a trophy. So I'll be in Parliament on Friday to support this bill. I hear the arguments made on behalf of some countries in Africa who are saying this, but I don't think that a vote should be necessary in Parliament on Friday. The government's brought this legislation. People feel very strongly that it's wrong to be so cruel to animals and treat them as objects in this way. So there really shouldn't be a division in Parliament on it. I'd have hoped it had been something that all MPs, regardless of party, could support. A lot of my constituents have written to me
There's always one that won't. So we can probably even speculate who it might be. Stephen?
Right, so obviously people find hunting for trophies quite distasteful, and personally when I see the photos of it I do think it's a bit off. But
a bit off? Is that all you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm afraid one of the things I do find a bit weird about this country is that we'll do lots of awful things to animals provided we eat them. But look, ultimately, in the bush, not as in Stephen Bush, but in the bush in Zambia and South Africa, which is one of the parts of the world I'm from, you do actually have to have some degree of pest control for some of these big beasts. It does cost money to do so. It does bring in tourism capital. I find it odd that a country in which the fox hunting ban is not really enforced other than by SABS has decided that it's going to impose that ban on other countries. I think that it's obviously...
Foxes are vermin, lions aren't.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, lions do disrupt livestock and do disrupt livestock and do disrupt farmland too, as indeed do elephants. But yeah, look, I think ultimately the problem is that no country should have to be dependent on big game hunting for its tourism. But I think this measure might be too much too soon.
Okay. Juliet.
I find it interesting that Richard's, for example, commitment to decolonisation is only skin deep, because when it comes to imposing his tastes on a whole load of countries who have explicitly said that you can help us to preserve these amazing creatures by not doing this, that's just thrown out of the window. And if you go to the border of Zimbabwe and South Africa, and you go to different reserves where one allows trophy hunting, and on the Zimbabwean side it's not done, you will find many more animals on the side where trophy hunting is allowed, because there is actually a monetary incentive to breed animals, to preserve them and to protect them. So I think this is one of these instances.
Before they're killed by trophy hunters.
Well, yeah, before a proportion of them are killed by trophy hunters, yes. But I mean, unless you're a vegetarian or a vegan, or you opt out of any part of our economy that involves wares that come from animals, then you are just as implicit in the killing of animals. It's just that you don't happen to see a photo you find distasteful on Instagram. Well, the fact is that's irrelevant to the welfare of habitats and the welfare of animals more broadly, and the welfare of the economies of these countries.
Oh, how I wish we'd come to this question a lot earlier and we could have spent longer on it, but we can't, because we have a final email question from Chris, who says, understanding that Richard Burgon is a big death metal music fan, which band or artist from the UK are the panel listening to at the moment? Death metal.
Well, if people want to learn about death metal, they should definitely watch the interview that Ed Miliband did with Barney Greenway, the vocalist of Napalm Death. He actually was tutoring Ed Miliband in how to vocalise in a death metal way. But the band that I'm listening to at the moment, and it's the most popular heavy metal band of all time, is Iron Maiden, because I'm looking forward to seeing them for about the 30th time this June at the O2 Arena. So I've been listening to their back catalogue in preparation for July.
Good West Ham supporters.
They are, yeah.
You asked from the UK. I'm listening to a British DJ called Crafty Cuts with a K. He's great. If you want to dance, you should put him on.
Andrea.
So, well, I'm going to go and see Coldplay in Manchester later on in the summer. So that a bit. But actually, I tend to listen to compilations on Apple, depending on my mood. So I can't really say. I mean, favourite bands are things like Queen and Elton John and ABBA. Is that really uncool?
Not at all.
Thank you.
Stephen.
So I'm actually listening to a saxophonist called Laura Mish, who was playing at King's Place last week. Very good. She's unfortunately from South London, but no one's perfect. And she's brilliant modern jazz musician.
Well, I'm listening to Rina, is it Sakawara? Something like that. She was on the Graham Norton show a few weeks ago, and I downloaded her album, and it's fantastic. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this week's run of Cross Question. We'll be back with another one on Monday, or will we? More on that tomorrow, he says in a radio tease. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. Labour is calling Jeremy Hunt's first budget as Chancellor lacking ambition. In it, he announced plans to make it easier for parents to go to work, along with other tax measures to make it more viable for older people with good pensions to continue working in places like the NHS. In the Commons, Jeremy Hunt called his package a budget for growth, but the founder of Phones for You, John Caldwell, has told LBC he disagrees.
There are some good component parts in the budget.